This is Duke University.
So it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to Jews and the Ends of Theory conference. After more than 3 years of planning and preparations, I actually checked my emails, and we started in February 2010. The conference is made possible by the generous support of Duke Center for Jewish Studies. Oh, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Shai Ginsburg, and I'm an assistant professor of Hebrew and Israeli Cultural Studies at the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies here at Duke University. Now, the conference is made possible by the generous support of the Duke Center for Jewish Studies, the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, the UNC Kaplan Chair, John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, Duke Dean of Humanities, the Institute for Arts and Humanities at UNC, the Department of Religious Studies at UNC, and the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Duke. Many are due special thanks for their help in bringing this conference about. Without their enthusiasm, encouragement, and support, this event would not have materialized. Srinivas Aravamudan, Dean of the Humanities at Duke University, Ian Bockham, our host today, Director of the Franklin Humanities Institute, Eric Meyers, Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Duke University, Jonathan Hess, Director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, and John McGann, Director of the Institute for the Arts and Humanities at UNC. And really special thanks are due to the people who actually did most of the work for this conference. Serena Elliott from the Center for Jewish Studies at Duke University, Hope Tosher from the Department of Religious Studies at UNC, Alison Barnes and Christopher Meineke from the Institute for the Arts and Humanities at UNC, and the people of the Franklin Humanities Institute, our hosts, Christina Chia, Beth Perry, and Hannah Jacobs. And last, Janice Jong, who shouldered most of the administrative burden for this conference. Professor Laurie Patton, Professor of Religion and Dean of Arts and Sciences here at Duke University, could not join us today because she's out of town. But she asked me to read the following message. I would like to welcome you to the conference on Jews and the Ends of Theory. The questions it raises are fascinating ones, linking our theories of modernity and postmodernity to a particular cultural tradition. Many scholars have asked us to conceptualize literature, history, media, and the production of the text, and yet few conferences have asked us to do so in the light of the end of theoretical traditions. In my own field of the study of religion, W.C. Smith wrote, quote, "The meaning and end of religion, with both senses of the word end in mind. The goal of religion as well as the end of its uses as an analytical term." I will be eager to hear whether both of those uses are discussed at the proceedings, and if so, what kind of alternatives are put forward, given that there are so many ways to move forward. In addition, the topic of this conference reminds one how important it is to think about theory through the lens of a traditional other. How profound an effect, for example, the role of the Jew had in theories of mythology of the 20th century. Indeed, one could argue that the grand theories of mythology attempted by authors like Hume, Corbin, and Eliade were formulated through a peculiar erasure of the Jew and Jewish tradition. One can think of so many examples just like this. Now, this conference has invited us to do so. I congratulate you on your conceptualization of this project and look forward to hearing reports. Welcome to Duke. And to greet participants, I invite Eric Meyers, the Bernice and Morton Lerner Professor of Religion and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Duke University.
Bruchim habayim, welcome everyone. One of my colleagues in Jewish studies who read about the conference quipped, it should really read without the S. That is, Jews and the end of theory. As this group surely knows better than most, Jewish scholars are not particularly at home in critical theory, just as most Jewish scholars are not at home in theology. Be that as it may, you have come together in full knowledge of the challenges before you and in the disciplines you represent. Your conversations together here should ignite much fruitful discussion and intellectual engagement. In order to have these discussions, you have come to the Jerusalem of the South, known today as the food capital of the Mid-Atlantic and the heart of Tobacco Road, famous for its basketball, but also home to Duke and UNC Chapel Hill, who together have planned this program and convinced enough funders and programs to bring you all here. And it's good to see a public university and a private university work so closely together in the field of Jewish studies, and our ties together cross many fields besides Jewish studies. Jewish studies at Duke goes back to World War II, when Judith Goldstein began his distinguished career as a professor here. And even before the war, one of our divinity professors excavated the Western Wall in Jerusalem and focused on Robinson's Arch. And in 1948, it was a Duke PhD student who was at the American School in Jerusalem when the Dead Sea Scrolls turned up one day. William Brownlee, author of the Editio Princeps of the Pesher Habakkuk and the Serach Hayacha. If you thought you were coming to Midbar Yehuda to have these discussions, you are sadly mistaken. Now that I've stated our bona fides, I can welcome you officially in behalf of the Center for Jewish Studies and Duke University, and I want to thank also the organizers, Shai and Jonathan, for making this happen, and I hope you all enjoy and benefit from your conversations together. May the ends of theory take you to places you have not been before and allow your research to prosper and flourish. Ahlan wa sahlan, welcome.
And I would like now to introduce Jonathan Boyarin, our convener, the Leonard and Toby Kaplan Distinguished Professor of Modern Jewish Thought at UNC.
Actually, Eric, the reason that we needed 3 years lead time was because we spent the first year and a half debating whether or not the S was going to be there. If you follow the email trail, I think it started without the S. More or less optimistic takes on the topic. Welcome, and I want to make sure that Shai gets thanked. It's been a pleasure conceiving and developing this project with him. My doctoral advisor at the New School for Social Research, anthropologist Stanley Diamond, wrote in the early 1980s of the long history of ambivalence in Gentile projections about Jewishness that it, in his words, reveals the storied existence of the Jews as the unresolved primitive myth of Western civilization, a myth without a resolving ritual, a myth that is therefore acted out to the climax of self-destruction in the politics of the West. To my knowledge, that was as far as Diamond ever went in connecting questions of Jewishness to the universal primitive state of human society. The thrust of his work, however, was aimed at constructing a positive and rich picture precisely of the primitive, which he viewed as a model alternative to the alienation and class rigidities of civilization. More than just a lost ideal, for Diamond, the primitive was also a potential antidote, as he urged his readers to let the primitive grow inside us. To be sure, Diamond never denied his own Jewishness, having, among other things, been born to a Yiddish-speaking family on the Lower East Side, and done extensive fieldwork on a kibbutz in the young state of Israel. On the other hand, it seems Diamond was in no position to suggest what such a resolving ritual of Judaism as the West's primitive myth might look like. The more so as, in that very same essay, he denied the existence of any genuine Jewish culture, explaining instead that a text is not a culture. In terms full of pathos, but strangely void of ethnographic insight, he went on to describe the Jews as people without a society, haunted by archaic references, trying to live in abstractions, and having been close to extinction on several occasions, nevertheless maintaining an indomitable passion for survival. This, again, from a professional ethnographer who had written insightfully about the politics of fieldwork and against the denigration of contemporary primitive societies. There is no advantage, I think, in calling once again upon Isaac Deutscher's provocative figure of the non-Jewish Jew to describe the phenomenon of those critical intellectuals. We may think here of Arendt, Adorno, to a great extent Freud, Butler, who, like Diamond, affirm or do not deny their Jewishness, but for the most part do not draw on Jewish critical resources in their work. Insofar as the figure of the non-Jewish Jew invokes categories of so-called religious practice or belief, it simultaneously reinforces the modern effort to reduce Jewishness to a single acceptable slot within Western liberal polities and denies indigenous criteria for Jewish identity. Moreover, the label of non-Jewish Jew makes things easier for those who would deny the demands such figures make on those who do care seriously about Jewishness for itself, if there ever could be such a thing, as well as for others. A pity, for we're just beginning to absorb, for example, the impact of Hannah Arendt's recently collected Jewish writings on our reception of her work as a whole. Or, if, to take another example, we persist in thinking of Jacques Derrida as not so Jewish, we risk reducing his late rich writings on Jewishness to the sentimentalism of the aging. On the other hand, there's surely a price to be paid for statements such as Diamond's denials that the Jews in diaspora lacked a culture or a society. As, to take a more recent example, there's a price to Judith Butler's repeated and generally correct incantation in her challenging and thoughtful book on Jewishness and Zionism that Jewishness must be constituted in relation to the non-Jewish other. As though that were an insight we owe solely to Emanuel Levinas. That her unspecified interlocutors are trapped within some vague, unreflective rhetoric of collective identity she deems communitarian. Or that many Jews do not find, quite validly, other Jews to be a sufficient and indeed overwhelming ethical challenge. Such lapses may limit the audibility of urgent political messages. Also, far too often, still here, at the onset of the second Christian millennium, the affirmations of Jewishness in such critical work are restricted to a penchant for universal humanism, or the empathy potentially born of collective memory of suffering, or even the kind of neo-Kantian ethical monotheism whose potential risks were precisely analyzed in Derrida's own essay on Hermann Cohen, Interpretations at War. Now, I would not have these comments so far read as a variant on Gershom Schollem's complaint to Arendt that she was lacking in love for the Jewish people, nor even that anyone like the figures I've evoked so far failed to say enough about their own or anyone else's Jewishness. Jürgen Habermas was probably right to refer to the German idealism of the Jewish philosophers. There is no shame and plenty of honor for them in that. A thinker of Jewish background has no more obligation to speak of Jewishness than a geneticist of Jewish background has to study Jewish genes. Yet, thinking oneself entitled to speak authoritatively of Jewishness because of one's Jewish genes, or even because of a positive Jewish childhood, is an oddly essentialist affirmation for any critical thinker. I am not speaking of loyalty here, but of literacy. It is no secret that, for the most part, a key criterion for Jews seeking their entry tickets into Western society was the abandonment of traditional Jewish literacies and idioms. Nor should it be any secret that the cultural politics of Jewishness in the modern West has entailed a view of those Jews who do retain traditional idioms and practices as bad, recalcitrant citizens of modernity, much like those among the colonized who failed or refused to get with the civilizing mission. Hence, critique of Jewishness in modernity, even when done by those nominally or professedly Jewish, has tended to resort to a crabbed, reduced, and even stereotyped caricature of Jewish being, often unrecognizable to those more fully and affirmatively engaged in the performance of Jewishness. It is unlikely that Stanley Diamond imagines a recognizably Jewish answer to Jewishness itself as the unresolved primitive myth of the West. And I suppose we are in any case best advised to stay away from dividing our tentative responses into Jewish and other. Yet I want to stress that his dictum insists on the centrality, not the marginality, of Jewishness to the constitution of the Occident, and thus calls for renewed and sustained reflection. And perhaps we're in a better position today, even than 30 years ago, to begin addressing the question in ways that also incorporate the critical vitality of lived Jewish traditions. With that challenge in mind, and with that much, at least, of a genealogy of my own pertinent thinking, let me set forth the conception of this conference as Shai Ginsburg and I drafted it some 2 years ago. We wrote, Jews and Marxism, Jews and the avant-garde, Jews and modernism, Jews and the nation, Jews and abstraction. The linkage between Jews and critical theory lurks under various rubrics in the history of Europe's world, in the collapse of that world in the near century following World War I, and in the fleeting transfer of world dominance to the United States. But what are the relationships between Jews and theory now? What role has Jewishness played in our conception of theory? How has the figure of the Jew shaped Euro or Americentric theories, discourses on colonialism? And how do we think, or more prescriptively, how should we think and talk about Jews, Jewishness, and theory when the promises of European modernity lie in wreckage around us as around its former colonies, when U.S. cultural dominance appears on the wane, yet what will replace these is not yet clearly on the horizon? This conference will broadly explore a series of questions about the relationship between Jews, Jewishness, and theory now. First, what role does the figure of the Jew, or Jews, and his or her Jewishness play in contemporary theory? For at least a century and a half, such figures occupied a privileged place in theory. We may take Marx's essay on the Jewish question as a not entirely arbitrary starting point. Is there any sense in continuing to privilege such figures? If so, what work would they do? We would like to consider these questions in light of the resistance to theory within and around the disciplines that variously serve as home for scholars in the academic field known as Jewish studies. What are the possible and actual relations between theory and Jewish studies? How has the theoretical figure of the Jew shaped the encounter, both real and figurative, between Jews and Arabs in general, and between Jews and Palestinians in particular? Second, since the late 19th century, Jewish intellectuals have been disproportionately represented in the discourses of European and American theory. Freud, Jacobson, Scholem, Benjamin, Adorno, Lévi-Strauss, Arendt, Lukács, Derrida, Levinas, and Chomsky, to name a few. The cohort that has succeeded them appears to be more diverse. How might we understand the figure of the Jewish intellectual in the aftermath of these giants? Third, how does the notion of the end of theory, related to varying degrees to discourse on the end of politics or even the end of history, play into these questions? How, if in any significant way, is it related to the changing or disappearing figure of the Jewish intellectual, or of Jewishness in theory? Is it worthwhile to think the notion of end Jewishly as a reflection about Jews in theory? And finally, a set of reflexive considerations to inform all of the foregoing. How is the linguistic turn of 20th century theory related to its Jewishness? What might we learn from this relation about the sources of outrage against the language of theory itself? What language, if any, is suitable for such a set of inquiries? That, at any rate, is the language of the proposal Shai and I sent to our potential interlocutors. As in any such conference of this nature, conveners propose and speakers dispose. In other words, that is only the beginning of the conversation. We are delighted and honored at this gathering. Quite likely, at the end of the coming 2 days' reflections, we may be no closer to a resolving ritual of Jewishness in the West, but we should have a better and shared sense of the stakes in question. Maybe we will even come closer to determining whether there can be a language suitable for continuing this set of inquiries. Again, then, welcome, and may we all hear each other well.
Good morning. I'm Lieber, the Assistant Director of the Center for Jewish Studies and Associate Professor of the Department of Religion, and it is my pleasure to welcome our first keynote speaker of the conference. Seyla Benhabib is the Eugene Meyer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy at Yale University and was Director of its program Ethics, Politics, and Economics from 2002 to 2008. Professor Benhabib has served as the president of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She has taught at the New School for Social Research and Harvard University, where she was a professor of government and chair of Harvard's program on social studies. A Guggenheim Fellowship recipient, she has been a research affiliate and senior scholar at many institutions in the US and in Europe. Professor Benhabib is the author of numerous works, both timely and enduringly significant, including Critique, Norm, and Utopia, a study of normative foundations of critical theory, Sustaining the Self, Gender, Community, and Postmodernism in Contemporary Ethics, winner of the National Education Association's Best Book of the Year Award, The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt, The Claims of Culture, Equality, and Diversity in the Global Era, The Rights of Others, Aliens, Citizens, and Residents, which won the Ralph Bunche Award of the American Political Science Association and the North American Society for Social Philosophy Award. Another, Cosmopolitanism, Hospitality, Sovereignty, and Democratic Iterations, and Dignity in Adversity, Human Rights in Troubled Times. She has recently edited, together with Judith Resnick, Migrations and Mobilities, Gender, Borders, and Citizenships, named by Choice one of the outstanding academic books of the year. Together with Judith Butler, Drusilla Cornell, and Nancy Fraser, Feminism as Critique, and also Politics in Dark Times, Encounters with Hannah Arendt. Her work has been translated into German, French, Italian, Turkish, Swedish, Russian, Serbo-Croatian, Hebrew, Japanese, and Chinese. And she's also edited and co-edited volumes on topics ranging from democracy and difference to feminism as critique, the communicative ethics controversy, and identities, allegiances, and affinities. Professor Benhabib has held many prestigious visiting professorships, such as the Spinoza Chair in Amsterdam, given the Gauss Lectures at Princeton, delivered the John Seeley Memorial Lectures at Cambridge University and the Tanner Lectures at Berkeley, and the Cátedra Ferrara Mora Distinguished Professor in Girona, Spain. She's been adjunct faculty in law at Yale Law School, a visiting professor of law at the University of Tel Aviv Center for Advanced Legal Studies, and a Strauss Fellow at NYU's Strauss Center for Advanced Studies in Law and Justice. It is my pleasure and honor this morning on behalf of Duke University, UNC, the Center for Jewish Studies, and the organizing committee of this wonderful conference to welcome our distinguished lecturer, Professor Benhabib, who will be speaking on Jewishness and Zionism, Thinking Disjunctions from Moritz Goldstein to Judith Butler. Please join me in welcoming Professor Benhabib.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure, and quite challenging and daunting for me to be the keynote speaker for this conference. I spent my life specialized in high German thought, 19th century and 20th century, and as Jonathan mentioned, there comes the point when you sort of dig a little and discover maybe some things that I haven't publicly spoken about in recent years. So I'd like to begin with some autobiographical reflections, also by way of an introduction to who I actually am, and not just the German critical theory scholar, feminist scholar that you know me to be. Last April, I was awarded the Leopold Lucas Prize of the Theological Faculty of Tübingen. I must admit to being very surprised by this, not only because the theological faculty would consider me worthy of a prize, but because of Rabbi Lucas, in whose name I was honored. He was the founder of the Gesellschaft zur Förderung der Wissenschaft des Judentums, a practicing rabbi in the town of Golgau, close to the Czechoslovakian border, and died while performing rabbinical duties in Theresienstadt. His wife was murdered in Auschwitz. The prize was established by one of his sons, who fled to Latin America and is now administered by his grandson, Dr. Lucas. The floodgates of personal memory were opened, and I began to meditate about why I, a Sephardic Jew from Turkey, had found in the German and German Jewish high theory the language of theoretical and existential reflection. Where are the ends of theory for me? Permit me then these few personal recollections as an entry. At the start of the 16th century, after the Inquisition in Catholic Spain, many Jews escaped to neighboring Portugal, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. Our earliest known ancestor, and I hope this is historically accurate, the Rabbi Jacob ibn Habib, whose Arabic last name means son of Habib, just as the ban in my last name means son in Hebrew, was among the foremost members of the northwestern Spanish city of Zamora. He tried to negotiate with the Spanish authorities to have the Jews of Zamora remain in exchange for land and money. When this failed, he fled to Portugal and from there to the provinces of the Ottoman Empire, first to Jerusalem and then to Salonika, and then eventually my family found its way to Istanbul, one branch. The Jews of Spain were offered hospitality in the traditional sense by the Ottoman Empire, and in 1992, the 500th anniversary of the beginning of Spanish life on Ottoman shores was celebrated with great fanfare. I'd like to mention briefly two more historical episodes in the collective memory of Sephardic Jews that have deeply marked my own intellectual and political orientation. For most Jews of Turkey, the name of Shai Ginsburg conjures memories of humiliation, betrayal, and shame. The false messiah, whose reputation was saved from the dustbin of history by the magisterial work of Gershom Scholem, for the Jews in Turkey remains a reminder of their weakness and impotence when confronted with the Sultan's might. Shabbatai Tzvi was invited into the Sultan's tent as a Jew and emerged as a Muslim. The Dunmes, those who converted, of Salonika, the followers of Shabbatai Tzvi, went on to play a very significant role in the administration of the Ottoman Empire, a role not unlike that of the Schutzjuden in Austro-Hungary and the Kaiserreich. They were also among the first parliamentary representatives, together with Armenians and Greeks, to the Ottoman constitutional assemblies beginning in 1871. Yet the memory transmitted to me of the sad episode of Shabbatai Tzvi and the Dunmes is one of the Jews' inability to stand up for themselves and take their fortunes into their own hands. The sense of vulnerability was even more intense when commingled with the gratitude that the Jews of my parents' generation felt in the face of Hitler's armies. My parents were married on September 1st, 1939, as Hitler marched into Poland. Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey, had died in 1938. The new republic was 15 years old. Was there to be a war of succession? Would Atatürk's legacy be honored? And above all, since the Ottoman Empire and the Kaiserreich had been allies in World War I, would Turkey stay out of the war, or would the Jews of Turkey perish in the hands of the Nazis? The new president of the Turkish Republic kept his country out of the war by providing the German army in the Balkans with logistical and food supplies. But the young Jewish men of Turkey were rounded up and sent to labor camps in Anatolia, some of whom were told they were digging their own graves. My father had a military exemption. The Jews of Turkey were once more saved by their protectors, yet this rescue, if anything, heightened their sense of vulnerability and perhaps also resentment towards their Turkish benefactors. The Turkish Republic had declared them to be equal citizens and entitled them to equal rights, except that terms such as azınlık, minorities, originating with the Lausanne Agreement, circulated in official and unofficial language. We were excluded from promotion to officers' ranks in the army, and compared to the enormous political and civic engagement of European Jewry in their respective governments, the number of Turkish Jewish members of parliament, politicians, journalists, and even academics, a Jewish career all over the world, were minimal. We were equal, yet different. I offer these autobiographical observations as an entry to the larger themes of the paradoxes of equality and difference under conditions of Western modernity. What did it mean for the individual to be an equal citizen and to wish to retain one's ethnic, cultural, and religious differences, or maybe get rid of these differences? No other intellectual tradition equals, I think, the intensity, the ingenuity, and honesty with which these paradoxes have been explored, as in the German-speaking Jewish one. This is true not only for the towering figures of Hermann Cohen, Gershom Scholem, Hannah Arendt, Leo Strauss, Hans Kelsen, Walter Benjamin, Max Horkheimer, and Theodor Adorno, and many others, but for the lesser-known figures such as Moritz Goldstein, whose insights I find remarkably for our condition today, and whom I will explore in this lecture. Certainly, there are important debates about the degree to which the story of German, or more accurately of German-speaking Jewry, has dominated Jewish historiography and philosophy since the Holocaust. By taking this narrative to be paradigmatic, doesn't one do injustice to other Jewish experiences, including my own, originating in the countries of the Middle East and former Arab lands? Doesn't one obscure the narratives of the Sephardic Jews from Spain and the Mizrahi Jews of the Middle East? Stephen Ashheim quotes the philosopher Hugo Bergman, writing in a letter to his friend Robert Welch, I quote, "When our European generation makes its exit, Jewry here will become like those today in Baghdad," end of quote. Despite these legacies of Eurocentrism, which weigh heavily on this tradition, I think, I've always thought, there is a universalizable kernel to the German Jewish encounter with modernity, and which is what I intend to explore in this lecture. There is, I believe, an added urgency in our times to retrieve some of the pre-Zionist as well as lost cosmopolitan traditions of European Jewry. Despite the Holocaust, and precisely because of the Holocaust, today more than ever since the end of World War II, Europe once more faces the problem of how to deal with the eternally half-other, the ewig halb-andere, in the words of Moritz Goldstein. For the Jews of Europe, this project was destroyed, although remnants and even new offshoots of a revival of Jewish culture are visible in Germany, France, the UK, as well as Spain. In its treatment of the Muslim other, Europe is once more experiencing a dialectic of enlightenment, which it first encountered with the experience of Jewish modernity in the nation-state. This is evident in the many ways through which controversies about the wearing of the hijab in France or about circumcision in Germany begin by targeting the Muslim and all of a sudden discover the Jew. If, as French President François Hollande recently stated, France is to pass a law banning the wearing of all ostentatious signs of religious belonging, such as the hijab, the yarmulke, the Sikh turban, not only in public, but in private organizations as well, Orthodox Jewish kindergartens and schools would lose their identity no less than the Muslim ones. And if, as one local court declared recently in Germany, circumcision of male children is an assault on their human rights, then, as the German Conference of Jewish Rabbis pointed out, this would ban the Jewish Brit no less than the Muslim Sunnah. And as Jacques Derrida had observed a while back, terms such as guest and guest worker are inadequate to deal with the complexity of hyphenated identities in contemporary Europe, since they cannot easily be disentangled from their origins in the Inquisition and European colonialism. It may be illuminating, therefore, to begin with some thinkers who reflected on Jewish difference as it encountered German modernity at the beginning of the last century. In particular, I want to discuss an essay by Moritz Goldstein in order to show the remarkable parallelisms between some of his insights and Judith Butler's recent attempt to retrieve sources of Jewishness that can be deployed in the critique of Zionism. I'm not in agreement with Butler's critique, as I will explain, but I believe that it is crucial today to retrieve those sources of Jewishness that are also of a more cosmopolitan predilection. Let me begin with Goldstein. In 1912, Moritz Goldstein, a German Jewish publicist and journalist, published an essay called The German Jewish Parnassus, Deutsch-Jüdische Parnass, in the nationalist weekly, the Kunstrat. The essay brought its author the accusation of being a self-hating Jew and of allying himself with the Deutschnationalen, some of whom at that point wanted nothing more than a clear acknowledgement of the impossibility of being a German and a Jew. Not only did Goldstein suffer the contempt of both the Zionists and the anti-Semites, he also drew upon himself the wrath of assimilated Jews who considered themselves bearers of German culture as well as being good German citizens. Goldstein rejected Zionism and assimilationism. For him, the burning issue was to build a Jewish public sphere and a Jewish idiom, he calls it Sprechart, through which to express one's unique historical, cultural, and scientific orientations and achievements. Aware of the firestorm that this essay was sure to cause, in these very early pages, Goldstein writes, I'm quoting, "I wish as well that we could wash our dirty laundry in our own home. However, we do not have a home. A Jewish public sphere does not exist, neither in Germany, nor in Western Europe is it possible to address all Jews as Jews, even though we must accept that so much will be said about us by others," end of quote. By the way, this is written in fantastic German style for those of you who can read it. He was really a powerful writer. These are all my translations. With great verve and irony, Goldstein then narrates the enthusiasm with which the Jews of Europe, once the walls of their ghetto had been torn down, threw themselves upon the treasures of enlightened modernity. From journalism to art, from music to philosophy, European and especially German Jews made this new culture their own. They improved it creatively and transformed it enthusiastically. I'm quoting Goldstein again. Let us not deceive ourselves. We Jews among ourselves may have the impression that we are speaking to Germans as Germans. We have the impression. We may be named Max Reinhardt and may bring unimaginable excitement to the stage. We may be named Hugo von Hofmannsthal and introduce a new poetic style to replace the used-up language of Schillerian images. Or we may, as Max Lieberman, lead modern art. We may call that German. The others call it Jewish, and they hear an Asiatic tone, the Asiatische, in all of it. They miss the German sociability, Germanische Gemüt. And even when they find themselves compelled to acknowledge our achievements, even if with some reservations, they wish we could achieve less. End of quote. Goldstein then introduces a distinction between truth and science on the one hand and art on the other. There is no German, Chinese, or Jewish truth, nor a national science, he argues, but there is national art. Indeed, there is only national art, he says. It is not quite clear in the essay how this dualistic epistemology is justified. He's not a philosopher. Certainly, for him, the national element is neither the goal nor the telos of art, but is called, quote, the source of all achievement from Homer and the Bible to Tolstoy and Ibsen. All great artists have become great in and for their people, end of quote. If this is the case, if for a people, as well as for its art, the presupposition is that it must have a home, eine Heimat, then why not follow Zionism to Palestine and strive for the renewal of Hebrew language and poetry? Why not follow Gershom Scholem, for whom the bitter truths of this essay only strengthened his youthful resolution to leave Germany for Palestine? And even those of a more cosmopolitan disposition, such as Walter Benjamin and Hannah Arendt, acknowledged the force and truth of Goldstein's claims. And by the way, it was Hannah Arendt's essay on Walter Benjamin's angel that first drew my attention to the Moritz Goldstein essay, which I went digging about. Yet Goldstein was neither a Zionist, nor an assimilationist, nor really a cosmopolitan, nor a real religious Jew. The rest of us, he writes, however, are in Moses' position, who could see but not enter the promised land. We who have escaped from the ghetto, we the unhappy, happy children of West European culture, we the eternal half ones, the halb ewige, we the excluded, the ausgeschlossene, and the homeless, the heimatlose, we can't do anything with this new option, referring to Zionism. I'm going on with the quote. The young spirit that has burst forth from the old roots of the Hebrew language does not bring us new green shoots. All we have is the gray phrase, make your peace with it, sich abfinden. In other words, no matter how much we may wish to distinguish culturally between the Jewish and the non-Jewish, in order to finally leave compromise behind, he continues, the sense of only being half of something, this human and manly unworthiness one feels, this just seems to be impossible, at least in the near future, end of quote. Goldstein, who emigrated to the United States and wrote a retrospective called German Jewry's Dilemma, the story of a provocative essay in the Lieber book, Jahrbuch, does not explain why, in 1912, Zionism was not an option for him. This is all the more puzzling since he seems to share Herder's belief, also very widespread among Zionist pioneers at the time, that true art and literature require one to be at home among one's people and to articulate its genius. Goldstein believes that art is different from science and that art needs a home, a Heimat, or a ground from which it can spring forth, to use a Heideggerian locution. But for the eternal half ones, the excluded and the homeless, in his words, who are the Jewish heirs of West European culture and enlightenment, this is not an option. Yet, these outsiders, he claims, are not really outsiders, and herein lies the irony, because they can no more get rid of German or West European culture than this culture can get rid of them. The marginal, the excluded, and the eternal half ones, concludes the essay, belong to German culture. And I'm quoting, because German culture is in no small measure also Jewish culture. In these fast-moving and almost manifesto-like proclamations of the last pages of this essay, the project of forming a new cultural and political identity beyond assimilation and Jewish nationalism, in fact beyond all forms of nationalism, is anticipated. Writing as a European Jew, Goldstein defends the radical hybridity of cultural identity and achievement. He wants to acknowledge the degree to which German culture since the Enlightenment is also Jewish culture. He calls upon the Jews to reflect upon their experiences of modernity and the Enlightenment as Europeans and as German Jews. Far from being a cultural aberration and a political misfit, this interpretation of the eternal half-other, the ewig halb-andere is his phrase, projects a new identity that acknowledges marginality to be a new source of creativity. Often, all cultures are hybrid, It is only nationalist ideology that tries to freeze the living and self-contradictory flow that constitute cultures by hierarchically organizing them into an official center and leaving an unofficial, homeless marginality to the so-called others. The other that is constitutive of us is cast out and rendered alien, in Julie Kristeva's words, so that we do not have to face our own strangeness within ourselves, our own problematic multiplicity. Among contemporary cultural critics, it is Georg Steiner who can claim to wear Moritz Goldstein's mantle, and who has raised the status of the Jew as a half-other, as the, quote, moral irritant and insomniac among men, into Judaism's great and continuing contribution to humanity. Only when they are guests among nations, in the condition of perpetual exile, can Jews serve, argues Steiner, as the moral and cultural vanguard of nations. He writes, Stalin and Hitler made of the glorious noun cosmopolitan with its promise of the inalienable and murderous sneer, but did not Rashi himself, at acutest of Talmudic readers, tell of the everlasting need for Abraham to abandon his tent and rejoin the road? Did Rashi not instruct us that when asking the way, a Jew should prove deaf to the right answer, that his mission lay with being errant, which is to say, in error and wandering? End of quote. Steiner's contemporary cosmopolitan Jewish vision irritates many, just as Goldstein's image of the Jew as the eternal half-other did in its own day. In a bitter article called Georg Steiner's Jewish Problem, Asaf Sagiv, editor of the journal Azur, takes Steiner to task not only for his critique of Zionism and Israel, but also for his aloofness from traditional Jewish writing. Sagiv suggests that to demand of Jews that they remain eternal guests and wanderers among nations, acting as their moral conscience, may have more continuity with the anti-Semitic fantasy of the wandering Jew than with any kind of cultural or moral mission that ordinary Jewish human beings, who are not cultural aristocrats, can take upon themselves. That these struggles continue with such passionate intensity down to our own days shows, in my opinion, that they are intrinsic not only to the Jewish experience, but that they are built into the Greek grammar of the experience of political and cultural modernity. In the German Jewish encounter with political modernity, the contradictory presuppositions constitutive of every nation-state were revealed. Now that the weaknesses of the Westphalian state system are becoming increasingly apparent to all, while the alternative set of institutions to replace them are still remote, we can identify some of these paradoxes of the nation-state more vividly. The dignity of equal citizenship for all and the sovereignty claims of the nation. Whether the ethnic or the civic nation, there's discussion in political philosophy, but I want to just put this now on the table in these terms. The dignity of equal citizenship for all and the sovereignty claims of the nation are the dual sources of legitimacy in the modern nation-state, and the tensions among them have accompanied and inframed our political experiences since the bourgeois democratic revolutions of the 18th century. From Hannah Arendt to Hans Kelsen, from Leo Strauss to Hersch Lauterbach, Jewish political and legal thinkers have grappled with both dimensions of this paradox, while Kelsen, in his famous words, came to the conclusion, quote, that the idea of sovereignty must be repressed. Die Souveränitätsvorstellung freilich muss radikal verdacht werden, a thought that is now being re-examined in contemporary Europe. Hannah Arendt translated, as opposed to Kelsen, the political paradoxes of modernity into the demand that the right to have rights ought to be respected for all human beings. Yet it is also in her work that we encounter the deepest awareness that to be a right-bearing individual is to belong to a political commonwealth, I'm not saying a nation, a political commonwealth that defends and upholds one's right to have rights. The right to have rights does not presuppose a pre-political natural individual as conceived of fictionally in natural rights theories. Rather, it refers to the civil condition of the legal person and the citizen who belong to a polity. But if the sovereignty of the nation is interpreted in such a way that those bearing certain identity markers, the ethnos, are precluded from the demos, the people, popular sovereignty could lead to the denial of the right to have rights for some. For Hannah Arendt, the denationalization of the German Jews and their loss of citizenship, their subsequent exile to other countries, and eventually their mass extermination became the lens through which to focus upon what she famously called the decline of the nation state and the end of the rights of man. Arendt carried on the Moritz Goldstein tradition in her own unique way. Just as Goldstein sought a middle ground between pure assimilationism and Zionism through his concept of the Jew as the eternal half-other, Arendt praised the standpoint of the self-conscious pariah, Berton. Contrasting the pariah and the parvenu, the terms which she inherited from the French Jewish journalist Bernard Lazare, Arendt argued that whereas the parvenu erases her otherness and engages in sycophantic imitations of the dominant culture, the pariah is cast into marginality by this culture. The self-conscious pariah, by contrast, is the one who transforms the otherness of her identity into a moment of conscious opposition to the dominant culture, thereby regaining that self-respect that is denied to her by others through the very struggle to define her own identity. Just as in Hegel's slave-master dialectic, the pariah, like the slave, gains the right to say I, when she refuses to be defined by the terms set by the master's struggle in the struggle for self-definition. Reviving these moral and political resonances of the attitude of the self-conscious pariah and the eternal half-other, to reflect on Jewish Palestinian binationalism, Amnon Raz Krakowskian has recently written, I'm quoting, "Interestingly, Arendt's standpoint in this matter is quite similar to Gershom Scholem's, her old friend who became her arch-rival. Like him, she searched for a Jewish existence between orthodoxy, that as such remained closed upon itself, and assimilationism. Like him, she searched for a distinctive Jewish politics. Her pariah is obviously drawn from the figures of the Jewish heretics, such as were described by Sholem in his essays on Sabbatean subversive individuals since the 17th century. I'm not quite sure about the connections that Amnon is establishing here, but they're nonetheless worth reflecting upon. Whereas the young Gershom Scholem condemned sharply the misuses of Sabbatean messianism for Zionist and nationalist purposes, and rejected the denial of the rights of the Palestinian people, the older Scholem turned against the binational ideals which had animated him, as well as Hannah Arendt, Judah Magnes, Martin Buber, and many others. In the case of the establishment of the State of Israel as well, tragically, the triumph of national sovereigntism has led to the denial of the right to have rights to members of another people. This is why, in her clairvoyant and controversial articles on Zionism throughout the 1940s, Arendt kept warning against transporting to the Middle East legal paradigms and ideals of state formation emerging out of the European nationalist experience, and why she singled out the assumption that only a sovereign nation state could provide a homeland for the Jews for critiquing. In her recent book, Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism, Judith Butler outlines a vision of politics for Israel-Palestine, which she summarizes with the odd term, cohabitation. This is a vision inspired by radical democratic politics of binationalism, not in the narrow sense of one state, two peoples, but in the much deeper sense of acknowledging the ethical interdependence of the narratives of Jewish, Arab, and Palestinian peoples. Unfortunately, cohabitation is a misleading term that suffers from Victorian connotations of living or residing together out of wedlock. A more felicitous term would have been preferable. Nonetheless, Butler's achievement in this book is to retrieve Jewish ethical imperatives towards a vision of cohabitation by reviving Jewish memories of exile and persecution, and by re-examining long-forgotten distinctions such as those between cultural and political Zionism. In 8 penetrating essays, Butler considers Edward Said, Primo Levi, Walter Benjamin, Martin Buber, Hannah Arendt, Gershom Scholem, and above all, Emmanuel Levinas, to whom she is deeply indebted and against whose Zionist politics she finds herself struggling throughout the book. Like Moritz Goldstein, who is not mentioned, and like Hannah Arendt, to whom 1/3 of the book is dedicated, Butler tries to retrieve a vision of Jewish identity and ethics beyond Zionism. Let me state clearly, and I have stated this publicly, that I see no necessary connection between her ethical and political vision and her party praise for Hamas or Hezbollah, or her support of the Israeli boycott and divestiture movement. And I endorsed her receiving the Adorno Prize of the City of Frankfurt this summer. Her political positions are matters of political judgment, and in my view, hers are deeply mistaken ones. But there is, I think, more than a casual link between her vision of an ethics without normativity and a politics without historicity, and her blaming political Zionism for all the miseries and injustices that befell the Palestinian and Jewish peoples since 1948. While I welcome the discursive space that Butler is trying to create by re-engaging the critical dialogue about Israel and the state of politics in the Middle East, I do not believe that we will get very far by repeating the formula that Zionism is a form of settler colonialism, or that the struggle for Palestinian rights of self-determination is part of the struggle of the global left, whoever that may be. Certainly not in my book, Hamas and Hezbollah. These are not instances of thinking without banisters, but of thinking with banisters, as Hannah Arendt said. Philosophically, the most innovative aspects of her book are her reading of Levinas against Levinas, and her interpolation of Arendt for her own theory of cohabitation. Since I have recently reviewed Butler's book just last month in the journal Constellations, and discussed her interpretation of Levinas in greater detail there, here I'm going to confine myself to her reading of Hannah Arendt. Butler admits that she came to Hannah Arendt's writings rather late. She reviewed Hannah Arendt's writings, Jewish writings, in the London Review of Books in 2007 under the title, I Merely Belong to Them. By the way, when I wrote my Hannah Arendt book in 1996, a collection of these Jewish writings, the Jewish Prime, were already available, and they were also available in German, but they do really considerably change, our understanding of her scholarship to look at those 600 odd pages that are collected recently. Anyways, Butler reviewed these writings in the London Review of Books in 2007 under the title, I Merely Belong to Them. Deconstructing the distinctions between halakhic versus ethnic definitions of Judaism, between what one is born into, or one's genes, and what one chooses to be or is forced to be by the society around one, Butler's tone towards Arendt was skeptical. This has changed. The two chapters on Arendt in parting ways is Judaism, Zionism, or Arendt and the Critique of the Nation State, and the other chapter, Quandaries of the Plural, Cohabitation and Sovereignty in Arendt, take up nearly 70 pages in a 240-page work. Clearly, Hannah Arendt is challenging. And it's not hard to see why. In the last 2 decades, Arendt's writings on Zionism and Jewish topics have also been rediscovered by revisionist Israeli scholars who see in her reflections on Zionism throughout the 1940s a forewarning of the tragedies that were to befall the Israeli and Palestinian peoples. Butler is aware of this revisionist Israeli historiography, and Stephen Arsheim's book, Hannah Arendt in Jerusalem, I think is a very important collection about the reception of this work by Israeli scholars. So Butler writes, quote, but if it is historically and politically incumbent to understand that history as a founding catastrophe, and she uses the Palestinian term Nakba several times, and to locate the sites of its contingent emergence as that particular state's formation and not others, we might be able to think outside this narrative lockdown, end of quote. What fascinates Butler most are Arendt's last words against Eichmann in the epilogue to Eichmann in Jerusalem. I'm quoting. In her view, writes Butler, cohabitation, that is for Arendt, is not a choice but a condition for all political life, end of quote. This is a strange attempt to interpolate Arendt for Butler's own social ontology by the use of a term such as cohabitation, which is not Arendt's at all. Arendt writes, and I'm quoting this famous last sentences in Eichmann in Jerusalem, and just as you supported and carried out a policy of not wanting to share the earth with the Jewish people, and the people of a number of other nations, as though you and your superiors had any right to determine who should and who should not inhabit the world, we find that no one, that is, no member of the human race, can be expected to share the earth with you. This is the reason, and the only reason, you must hang. End of quote. These are dramatic sentences enactment in Jerusalem. Butler asked, is the final verdict that Arendt delivers something other than vengeance? And given that Arendt herself rejects vengeance as barbaric, her term, what else is going on in this passage? The epilogue to Eichmann in Jerusalem, and indeed the tone of the entire book, has been the subject of discussion among Arendt scholars for some time now. I've not rewritten about this. Butler is a careful and provocative reader of texts. Her reading of this passage not only examines Arendt's distinctions between mass murder, administrative massacres, and genocide, which are crucial for the legal aspect of the matter, but tries to tease out what she calls, quote, a principle out of Hannah Arendt's text. I'm quoting. If Arendt is right then, it is not only that we may not choose with whom to cohabit, but that we must actively preserve the unchosen character of inclusive and plural cohabitation. We not only live with those we never choose and to whom we may feel no social sense of belonging, but we are also obligated to preserve their lives and the plurality of which they form a part. In this sense, Butler writes, concrete political norms and ethical prescriptions emerge from the unchosen character of modes of cohabitation. End of quote. This may be Butler, but it's certainly not Hannah Arendt. Arendt writes of plurality and not of plural cohabitation. Let us recall for a moment here some of the most distinctive features of Arendt's understanding of plurality in order to drive to the point of why this is significant. Plurality for Arendt, along with worldliness and action, constitute the human condition, that is, the basic conditions under which life on earth has been given to human beings. Plurality is the fact that corresponds to our irreducible sameness as members of the same species, and yet at the same time expresses our irreducible difference from one another. Plurality, she writes, is the human condition of action because we are all the same, that is human, in such a way that nobody is ever the same as anyone else who ever lived, lives, or will live, end of quote. This plurality is the precondition of the possibility of political life. Because we are members of the same species, because we have speech and reasoning, and because we are capable of legging reasoned speech, we can communicate with one another, build a world together, as well as destroy one another. And since we are all subject to similar bodily needs and confront likewise the struggle with nature, we face the circumstances of justice, i.e. how to establish just institutions under conditions of the rough equality of human needs, talents and capacities, vulnerability and scarcity. Plurality is what enables diversity and respectability, I'm quoting, in acting and speaking, men show who they are, reveal their actively unique personal identities, and thus make their appearance in the human world, while their physical identities appear without an activity of their own in the unique shape of the body and the sound of the voice. The disclosure here of who, in contradistinction to what somebody is, his qualities, gifts, talents, and shortcomings, which he may display or hide, is implicit in what somebody says and does. For Arendt, we live in a world constituted by narratives about the who as well as the what of action. This web of narratives, or the web of stories, as she calls them, is the medium through which the multiplicity and diversity of perspectives on human affairs emerge and conflict, are woven together and torn apart. The crucial distinction between Arendt's concept of plurality and Butler's concept of cohabitation is that, for Arendt, plurality emerges for human beings through what they do, through speech and action. While it is in some sense grounded upon our being members of the same species, who are more or less equally vulnerable, speech and action constitute a new world of individuation and differentiation against the background of our natural givenness. The web of narratives is the medium through which multiplicity and diversity of perspectives on human affairs are knitted together. We tell of who we are and of what we do through a narrative. I have called that the narrative constitution of identity and action. By contrast, in Butler's account of cohabitation, there is no emphasis on either speech or action. Often cohabitation in her text sounds more like a Heideggerian condition of thrownness, Geworfenheit, of being thrown into the world with others with whom one has not chosen, than an Arendtian condition of plurality, and this, of course, has to do with her interpretation of Levinas's ethics. As embodied creatures, writes Butler, we should have to think about questions of need, hunger, and shelter as crucial to this plurality. In other words, plurality would have to be thought of as a certain kind of material interdependency, such that being able to live and being exposed to death are also in part at stake in the social condition. We find the idea of precarious life here, again, her term, which he's reading into Arendt. Whereas Arendt sees the political as the emergence of the Zoe out of the bios, Butler, in the mode of Heidegger and Levinas, wants to develop an ethics and politics by returning the Zoe back to the bios. Lost in this process are the categories of speech and action with others that are sine qua non of the political for Arendt and the source of normativity. Why does Butler avoid or elude these concepts? Principally because I think she's suspicious of Arendtian concepts of action and the self as harboring an indefensible vision of the sovereignty of the autonomous subject that Martin J., of course, has very well analyzed the crucial and ambivalent role of the concept of sovereignty in contemporary French and German thought. Butler is sometimes also uncomfortable with the possible essentialism that seems suggested by some of passages of Arendt's that emphasize the revelation of the self through speech and action as if there were a stable substratum of the self behind such deeds and words. Butler does not recapitulate the old debates between essentialism and performativity in the analysis of Hannah Arendt. Instead, she sees such a misguided concept of the sovereign self as being evident in Arendt's insistence that following Kant, one exercise reflective judgment. So bear with me, I'm going to go into one more second into Kant on reflective judgment. But these are important issues that are really at stake in this meeting. If Arendt, she writes, is only figuring sovereign decision here in her analysis of reflective judgment, showing what good decision is, or performatively enacting good decision on the model of the just sovereign, she has certainly taken distance from the notions of equality and the process of pluralization and universalization that characterize both her social ontology and the benefits of her theory for democratic politics. My point, she says, is neither that she subscribes to a notion of sovereign action at the expense of collective making, nor that she subscribes to social forms of deliberation at the expense of sovereign action and decision. Rather, I'm saying that she vacillates between the two, and this tension seems to form a recurring and irresolvable dimension of her thought. End of quote. Yet why not see this vacillation as a source of strength in Arendt's thought, rather than as a problem or a confusion? That is, the vacillation between individual reflective judgment and collective action and deliberation. Isn't it precisely because Arendt is a thinker of the political and not of cohabitation that she emphasizes the moment of individual action and decision as well as of collective resolve and deliberation? And what exactly does the recurring qualifier sovereign really add to this argument? In her reflections on thinking and moral considerations, which is what Butler is commenting upon here, Arendt stresses the need to be able to exercise individual judgment precisely during those moments when the chips are down and through the fabrication of lies and ideologies, the political world is being lost to us. Precisely during such moments, we have to be able to rely on some individuals as well as groups of individuals to defy the dangerous odds, exercise judgment, exhibit civic courage, courage civique, and engage in political action. All this is too individualistic for Butler and contradicts her emphasis on precarity and vulnerability. But let us ask then, what are the politics of cohabitation that Butler advocates? She seems to see an analogy between the Nazi refusal to cohabit the world with the Jews and the Zionist refusal to cohabit with the Palestinians, although this may be too blunt a way of putting the matter. The reason why, she writes, the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement includes among its goals the rights of Palestinians dispossessed in 1948, as well as the damaged rights of Palestinian Israelis, is that it is not possible to restrict the problem of Palestinian subjugation to the occupation alone. If we do that, we fail to see the structural link that continues between the Zionist demand for demographic advantage and the multivalent forms of dispossession that affect Palestinians who have become diasporic. Perhaps coexistence projects would fare better if they had as their single and guiding aim the undoing of Israeli colonial power and military force. End of quote. I'm not sure what Butler has in mind with this last sentence. It sounds as if it is a call in some form for the dismantling of the State of Israel and of its military in its current form. I say these words very carefully because I'm aware that this becomes a conversation stopper in contemporary Jewish circles, not in Israel, in the United States. Okay? So what kind of politics then follows from this notion of cohabitation and from this reappropriation or misappropriation of Hannah Arendt's plurality for her notion of cohabitation? Butler ends this paragraph by invoking promising forms of binationalism. What kind of binationalism is this? Unlike Butler, and here I'm going to put my chips down, I do not believe that Zionism was a colonial settler project from the start, intending to dispossess the Palestinian people and to rob them of their land. Hatched in the minds of a Viennese journalist, Theodor Herzl, and in the hearts of many Russian utopians who were in the Yeshiv much earlier, and adhered to by idealists all over Eastern Europe with the vision of creating a new Jewish people who would not suffer under the yokes of inequality, insult, and oppression that had been their lot in Christian Europe. Take Ahad Ham, for example, which is not discussed. This community in the Yeshiv would not have become a state had it not been for two historical reasons, which we well know. The Balfour Declaration, which showed the same blindness as all nationalist self-determination movements of the early 20th century did towards the claims of others, and more importantly, the Holocaust of European Jewry. Had it not been for the Holocaust, the small community of idealistic dreamers in Palestine would certainly have held the sympathy of the world Jewish community, but sooner or later, they may have disappeared as a separate political entity. As psychoanalytically astute as Judith Butler is, she seems to turn a blind eye to the lingering collective psychosis of many Jews, whether in Israel or not, namely, their fear of annihilation in the hands of a hostile world. Nonetheless, I join Butler in wanting to recreate the kind of Jewish discursive space which Moritz Goldstein was one of the first to articulate, namely, a space for the articulation of the creative sources that grow out of marginality, not belonging, or half-otherness. Zionism, no less than other ideologies of state and nation building in the 19th and 20th centuries, take Turkish nationalism, about which I could talk, is based upon mythical forms of re-narration. Such mythical re-narrations of the Jewish experience flatten out the contradictory, ambivalent, and not easily reconcilable lived memories of many Jews into a dominant national story of the struggle against assimilationism, extermination, survival, resistance, perseverance, and state and nation. The efforts of scholars of post-Zionism in contemporary Israel, as well as scholars of the Rainbow Coalition in Israel, has been now to retrieve the multiplicity of experiences and narratives from under the hegemony of the dominant Russian, Polish, and German Zionist narratives. Israeli culture, we may say, has rediscovered its own path to Moritz Goldstein's half-otherness. Unlike Butler, and as a Jew from the Middle East, I'm aware, however, of a certain Hegelian Liste Vernunft, cunning of reason here. Perhaps only because of the restoration of the rights to have rights to millions of stateless and homeless Jews via the founding of the State of Israel, is it possible today, once more, to want to retrieve the pre-Zionist plurality of experiences that constituted Jewish responses to modernity and to dilemmas of identity and difference in modernity? And I share the hope that there are sufficient ethical, cultural, political, religious, and aesthetic resources in the Jewish experience, such as to reposition the ends of theory always within the broader project of Tikkun Olam. Thank you. Questions? Conversation?
So, yeah, we have time, so I guess it.
Do you want some other?
So thank you for an absolutely wonderful presentation. In the light of what you said at the end, I wondered what you would make of something like Michael Walzer's project to recover kind of various other streams of Jewish political thought and his kind of multi-volume exercise of that. Would that fit with something of the vision you were laying out at the end there?
Great question, but I will have to claim a little bit of ignorance here. I haven't really done the kind of careful work with those volumes that they do require. Walzer was recently at Yale giving 3 lectures on the concept of self-determination, comparing India, Algeria, and Israeli independence movements. I'm very sorry to have missed them. I've been on sabbatical. But I think it is part of the retrieval of political thought in that period. And for some reason, I started looking at the Gandhi-Buber correspondence. I'm not exactly sure what got me to it. But it's really very, very moving because Gandhi is both expressing support for the establishment of the State of Israel. It's at the post-colonial 1948 moment, but yet at the same time, very early on, beginning to warn about the Palestinian problem. And Buber's answer is quite ethical and non-political, and we will hear a conference on Buber. So, in general, I think there is a great need to rethink this. What I think is a systematic political philosopher, I did something much more historical, cultural in this lecture. But in my opinion, there really is a need to rethink creative political modes of togetherness. Whether we call it consociationalism, binationalism, or post-sovereigntist polity formations, right? We need to do this, particularly in Israel, Palestine, for the entanglements, the distances, the interdependencies are so intense by now, are so intense that we have to go beyond the sort of the tired old formulas of militaristic nationalism. But this has to be done, I think. So in that sense, I think Butler is correct. But she's opening up this space as an ethical thinker and not as a political thinker. And thank you for also just say one more time, you're bringing this to my attention. I tend to work more with contemporary material than historical material, but I think the need to rethink this project so that the project may go on. Not that it may be destroyed, but because it may go.
Goldstein clearly was caught between a rock and a hard place, and he was looking for wiggle room, and there really wasn't any. Do you think this would be as stark if he was an Austrian than if he were German? And do you think that the kind of flourishment of Jewish/German/Austrian culture in Austro-Hungary is a kind of way out of the dilemma you described?
I'm not sure. I know what you're saying, because the Austro-Hungarian experience had much more, of course, forms of collective self-determination, as did the Polish experience, and maybe I'll let Svetlana talk about the Russian Jewish experience. I dare not go there. So yes, I mean, in a way, Goldstein's dilemma is caused by this very united kind of understanding of the nation, which, by the way, came late to Germany. I mean, it was basically the Prussian influence and so on. I mean, because we all have read, our Leonhard Krieger's history of German thought. It was, but he was basically, stuck between these alternatives, or rather, lack of alternatives. And it's interesting that he does not. There is no sense at all. I mean, when he calls for this Jewish public sphere, the jüdische Sprachart, jüdische Öffentlichkeit, he's still not talking about national self-determination. I mean, it doesn't seem to be either familiar with the East European experience. This always is sore point when you study this, because I know this also from, I know this also from, Arendt, the categories of the experience among the German Jews and, even the Austro-Hungarian and East Europe are so fundamentally different that sometimes translation is very difficult. And so, yes, I think it's a great question. Maybe his dilemma is very uniquely a German Jewish dilemma, not even a German-speaking Jewish dilemma.
So 1, 2, and then 3. Professor Shai.
So, first of all, thanks a lot for a great lecture, and I wanted to follow up on the issue of what you just mentioned about Michael Walzer and the self-determination. So, and I have a question about it related to your talk, but Walzer takes the examples of you said
Algeria, India, and Israel.
In Israel. And I think there's something highly misleading about it, because the discourse on Selbstbestimmung does not begin with post-colonialist. I mean, because we should be clear about it. I mean, it's an attempt of post-colonialists to adopt some of the top 19th century European nationalism, but Selbstbestimmung appears already in 50s Reden to the German nation. So perhaps there is a experiences background, I'm not sure about it, but it might be. But and when the Zionists was talking about self-determination in the early 20th century, they're not looking for their colleagues in Africa, etc. I mean, they are thinking about other Europeans and just modeling themselves. I mean, Nodal and Herzl is not post-colonialist to my mind. But there is one point which I think, if I understood you correctly, I mean, you're saying that you do not agree with Butler about the description of Herzl as colonialist. And I can understand the sense, because I don't share many of Butler's views, but just without giving the strong moral judgment, I think that if you look at what Herzl is doing, trying to find a place in Uganda, then going to meet with the Kaiser in Palestine, not to talk with the Palestinians or their leaders, but it seems on the face of it just a very typical European colonialist project, not necessarily worse than that, but just that's on the face of it, that's my impression that it is.
Thank you, Judith. About self-determination, of course, I mean, the concept of Selbstbestimmung, comes from German philosophy with all its problems, both on the Selbst side and the Bestimmung side. We keep working on the hyphen in every course, right? But there's also something else at this time, and that is that the Universal Declaration of Independence does recognize a right to self-government in its last article, and there emerges a new language, post-colonial language of the right to self-determination in that historical period. And it is different. It may have some of the same problems conceptually as the concept of Selbstbestimmung, but there is a new international right that then gets recognized. Also, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights finally, codifies this. So, one would have to look maybe even at the transcript of the Declaration of the State of Israel in the UN to see exactly what was invoked. I mean, Zionism and colonialism. Well. Yes. I mean, the very phrase, right, Israel-centered, you know, a land without a people for a people without a land, what land without a people? You know, I mean, they were invisible, just as, you know, the Native Americans were invisible here. I mean, that invisibility is, you know, is quite astonishing. Nonetheless, I guess what I'm trying to say here is this. There is a kind of knee-jerk position in thinking about politics, which is by analogy. The Jews did not go to Palestine for the same reason that the South African Boers went to South Africa. It's just not the same experience, I mean, and not the same intentionality. And you may say, well, objectively, it ended up in much the same way. Yes, unfortunately, alas, tragically, it did. But, you know, the early communities, I mean, if you read about this, I mean, I don't know, you know, you are an Israeli, and maybe I'm being a romantic here, you know, I have read enough Amos Elon and other things to know how ambivalent these communities of settlement were, but there was an ethical impulse. The ethical impulse was not to exploit the native population. That turned out to be a double-edged sword, right? I mean, I think it's Amos Elon who tells the story of, you know, some of the, you know, Palestinian peasants wanting to work in the, you know, early kibbutzim, and the kibbutzim saying, no, 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 we can't do that, we can't have Arab labor. That turned out to be, you know, a rather problematic thing because they could not think beyond it. But it is not the same thing as the South African experience. It is not the same thing as the scramble for Africa that all the European nations, you know, engaged in. So whatever form of colonialism it is, we have to learn to make defined distinctions. The reason why I think, sorry if I'm going on and on this because it's a subtle point. The reason why I think, you know, Butler is using this language is because it makes it seem as if the struggle in Israel-Palestine is the same struggle against anti-colonialism on the part of, you know, the so-called global. I want to make some distinctions because I'm no less desperate and critical about what's going on, you know, in Israel-Palestine than she is, but it ain't going to be, you know, helping anybody by trying to sort of, you know, see Zionism as a form of colonial settlement, the same with the South African Boers. That's, yeah, the microphone's coming.
Thanks, Jill, for an enormously rich and powerful talk, and I have 1,000 different questions. Let me just focus on the issue of self-determination and sovereignty, which I think is central to the argument. You've given us a wonderful sense of the ambivalence of self-determination, the self that is prior to determination, the self that is, in a sense, made by the determination, and this kind of dialectic of self-creation and being created somehow in the process. This also works not on just the individual level, but also on the communal level, whether it be a nation, or a polity, or a state, or some sort of collective enterprise. So that you have an interesting dialectic between individual sovereignty, the individual who judges, the individual who acts, the individual Arendt is more than just Judith's passive biologically determined, though she's not much of a biological determinist, but in this book she gives us a more passive version of the self. That, on the one hand, the individual self and the group self. Now, the fascinating issue, in a way, is the relation between these two notions of self-determination and sovereignty, and how they either fit together or are in some tension. So it seems to me that you're correct in saying that on the level of the individual, the self is both determining and self-determined, but also on the collective level. We have to recognize that there is this funny way in which selves are not given the collective nation, the collective identity, despite the mythic projections backwards, which, of course, as you correctly say, is part of the Zionist narrative, but also are up for grabs, and they're open-ended. But on the other hand, there is the possibility of their reification, becoming a second nature, becoming so fixed that they can't be easily dissolved, that they end up being historical facts or historical dead weight, whatever you want to call that sense of them not being as open, more inert. So the self that's made on the individual level is also a self that can be reified on the collective level. So then the issue is how these selves relate to other selves. And the let's call it utopian Arendtian version, is a kind of happy pluralism, a pluralism of either collaboration or agonism, but not antagonism. You know, a la Schmidt. But it is, in this particular case, the, alas, antagonistic relationship between these reified selves, these reified sovereign entities. That is the fact that we have to deal with. So is there much hope? I mean, I think Judith's version of it is far too utopian. But is there much hope for even dissolving antagonism into an agonism? Or is there more likely a kind of acceptance of a non-shared or relatively thinly shared space in which the two narratives simply divide rather than find some sort of way to overcome their antagonism? I mean, I'm giving you a more, let's say, pessimistic version, which goes against Judith's more perhaps naive optimism, but also the hopeful narrative of an Arendtian pluralism, which is at best collaborative and at worst only agonistic.
Thank you, great question. I mean, I like the phrase of, which of course takes us back to Adorno, that of defreezing narratives of sovereignty, both on the part of the self and on the part of the collective, that become like a second nature. And I'm no friend of the concept of sovereignty, and I find myself more and more to be a Kelsenian, Souveränität muss verdrängt werden. You know, why he said this from the standpoint of international law, but we can also extend it, you know, to psychoanalysis and in many other, you know, rich ways. The register moves in both directions, and I think that precisely, I mean, from a philosophical point of view, what is interesting about Kant's notion of reflective judgment is precisely this kind of non-sovereigntist attempt to find a mode of stability when he says, I must compare my judgment with the judgment of all others such that we can reach some kind of common agreement. And, you know, a lot of people take this to be, you know, full of the Habermasian illusions of it isn't. It's the process of seeking to develop judgment by the erweiterte Denkungsart, the enlarged mentality. But you're right. It is from Kant to Arendt to Habermas. It is a pluralism of agonism. It is not a pluralism of antagonism. Now, is that a consequence of a kind of deep-seated anthropological utopianism, hopefulness? Is it ultimately about, you know, human nature rather than, you know, the human condition? I think that, you know, to think about the political, one has to leave that space open. I mean, you know, Schmidt is very honest, right? He says, all serious thinking about the political must entertain the proposal that human nature is evil. And then he goes on to cite, you know, Hobbes, Donoso Cortes, the whole, you know, gallery of rascals, and except, you know, Hobbes I'm very fond of. But, you know, these are ontological questions about the measure of antagonism, agonism. I would say that theoretically, the way to think about this is in terms of the project of constitutionalism. That's why Arendt was not naive when she moved in and she wrote the book on revolution after the human condition, which is something that we don't pay much attention to, but it is an institutional attempt because, look, I think ultimately these questions are irresolvable. It is what Kant sees, you know, Madison sees. Politics does not need to suppose either the goodness or the evil in human heart. You know, no other than Kant says, suppose we were a race of devils, but the project of developing a constitution is, you know, what we are. It is, you know, the art of the political. This is what the political is. It used to be to try to change human nature. Maybe we've all become older, we've all learned more, that basically take human nature as it is and build the essential institutions, constitutions, and there is a very rich tradition of thinking about this. That's why the recent invocation of Schmitt, and people are not really always invoking, like our friend Andrew Arato does, Schmitt's most interesting writing, Constitutional Theory. But it's more these other more naive anthropological writings. Well, where do you go with it ultimately? So I want to insist on this sort of the institutional, constitutional imagination of the Kant, Arendt, and Madison. Okay. So coming back to the Middle East. We need to try to think new forms of constitutional coexistence beyond the tired old formula, one state. I'm an agnostic as far as what the people of Israel and Palestine want to do. If they wanted one state to say, but what's happening on the ground is that it is being made impossible by history, by the actions of the actors. Okay, so if that's what's happening, what can I do as a political philosopher? I can say, look around you. Things are happening in the European Union. Things are happening in international law. There was thinking in the 18th century, very important thinking, about federalism, confederalism, various forms of constitutional democracy. We need to bring these forms back because otherwise one is just sort of walking into what, some final disastrous encounter in the nuclear Middle East, with Iran. Thank God, at least nobody's talking about it for the time being. Netanyahu forgot that. So I don't want to get polemical. I am very passionate about this. It's just, but that's my agenda. I think cohabitation is maybe ethically suggestive, but it has its problems. I would much rather talk about pluralism, but I think my task as me in political philosophy is to try now to retrieve these other traditions and modalities of going beyond, murderous militaristic nationalisms on both sides. It's not the beginning of a long conversation. We always talk.
I think we've actually reached the end of the time for formal questions and answers, but I would like to invite everyone to stay for lunch and to continue the conversation informally and to enjoy the rest of this wonderful conference. Thank you so much, Professor Benhabib, for getting us off in such a rounded and
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.